All right, welcome to Studies in First Peter. We are going to be looking at First Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 19, and I entitled this section Suffering as Service. Um, Peter begins this section by referring warmly to his hearers as dear friends. It helps set the tone for the way in which he's speaking to them. And he is not criticizing them, but is speaking pastorally and wants to encourage them um, in their struggles. He calls these struggles a fiery ordeal. And again, it's another reference to the suffering they're experiencing. They're in confusion because they're suffering for being believers, and they think that this is something that's strange. But Peter wants to remind them that this is a test. Not a test that they're expected to fail, but a test that they can pass and be successful as believers. It's not something strange, and it should not surprise us. Peter says that we are suffering and being insulted for the faith. Rather, it's something that should cause us to rejoice. And he's going to explain that shortly. And also that we will be able to rejoice and see ourselves vindicated at Christ's return. So in verses 14 to 16, he says that if you're insulted for being a Christian, you're blessed. And you may wonder, well, where does Peter get that from? Well, you can remember that Peter gets it from Jesus himself, who, when he spoke on the Sermon on the Mount, said, "Blessed are you when you're persecuted for following me." So this comes right from the mouth of Jesus. But it's also something Peter would have very personal experience with. Remember, Peter failed to identify with Jesus and denied Jesus 3 times prior to his crucifixion. But then in the book of Acts, in chapter 5, verses 40 to 42, he literally, after being beaten, flogged for uh, obedience to preaching the word of Christ, uh, they rejoiced that they were able to participate in suffering for Jesus. So he has firsthand experience with this. He also says and makes it clear, and he's done this previously in this epistle, but that it's suffering for doing good that's rewarded. When we suffer, it shouldn't be for doing something bad. Suffering in itself is not where the glory lies. It comes as we identify with Christ. When we do well, we do good, and we suffer for it. That is what's commendable, and that's what Peter is saying is not something to be discouraged about, while at the same time saying we need to avoid any kind of suffering that may result from bad behavior on our part. And finally, we're to be reminded that as we suffer for being a Christian, this reminds us also that we are His. We are following in His footsteps. He also suffered on His path to glory. And so we, as Christ followers, should be willing to identify and participate with Him in that. So the last section in this passage is 1 Peter 4, 17 to 19. And it talks about judgment beginning in the house, with the house of God. And it seems to be that this might be a reference to the Old Testament prophets, where they predicted that judgment would start with God's people prior to the day of the Lord. But it remember may also simply be a reference to Christ's words of persecutions to come, as he talked about what was to come in the future, where he said, "You will be dragged before the courts," and that you're not to worry about what to say. So clearly, Jesus foresaw that his people would suffer. And then he quotes Proverbs 11:31, and he said, "If the righteous are just barely saved, what's going to happen to the sinner?" And so I think he's referring here to that we need to be watchful and careful. Um, that if we're going through this kind of suffering for the sake of Christ, how much more challenging is it for the unbeliever? And so we need to take that into account as we're experiencing persecution. And he closes this section off by saying that we are to commit ourselves to our faithful Creator. And it's interesting because God is not very often referred to as Creator in the New Testament, but it seems to be tightly connected with God's providence and care for us. Certainly in the Old Testament, God's creation and providence, his maintaining of creation, his providing for his people are closely associated. And so I think Peter here is hearkening back to that concept, and he emphasizes the faithful Creator, because the faithful Creator is the one who will be able to sustain us through suffering. So that's the passage for this week, and have a good day.